You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to Rethreading Madness.
When I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do.
I met Weetigo, a brilliant 60 Scoop survivor, through TikTok, where he talks about intergenerational trauma and epigenetic memory from the perspective of indigeneity. His intriguing ideas are based on what we know about trauma that weaves its way through families and is passed on through our DNA and creates within us, as he calls them, superpowers. But Weetigo goes further. He brings into that how autism, ADHD, CPTSD, and being gifted fits into intergenerational trauma and epigenetic memory. Weetigo is a member of the Poundmaker Cree Nation. Stay tuned for this fascinating conversation.
Young workers face many challenges today: unaffordable housing, underpaid and precarious work, and a rapidly changing labor environment. New and young workers are also more likely to be injured on the job. One of the best protections you have as a worker is solidarity. In other words, a strong union. Throughout history, unions have fought for the right to collective bargaining, better wages, benefits and working conditions, protection from abuse by employers, and ending harassment and discrimination at work. For more information on how to join a union, visit bcfed.ca/join.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I'm talking to somebody who online goes by the handle Weetigo. His adopted name is Frederick Thomas Edwards. His original name is William Ovid Kelly. And if all of that seems confusing, it won't be when I tell you that he's a 60 Scoop survivor who made it through on his own and has come to this place where he knows he's autistic, has ADHD, has CPTSD, and if you don't know what that means, we will be explaining it, and that he's gifted and, as he calls it, backwards. So welcome, Weetigo. So what does backwards mean to you?
It's the path that some people take. It's the most difficult path you can take, and it's the always being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's the path the Creator gives you to learn, I guess, as much as you can in order to bring that teachings back to the people. And once you find your way, and that's where I am right now. Is I'm sort of bringing what I've learned forward, and I've never been at a point in my life where I was able to share this, and I'm finding that the people, the community has been very receptive and welcoming in terms of what I've been presenting. It's kind of shocking because I've never had this before.
Well, I'm not Indigenous, but I certainly understand why the community is embracing it, because you are, as I've said to you on the phone before, brilliant and have a message that is very important. So Weetigo, you were taken in the 60 Scoop. Mm-hmm. Do you have any information about that? Or
yeah, I was part of the 60 Scoop. I was one of the number of children that were taken and abducted by the Canadian government. The Canadian government signed agreements with the provinces to take these children from appalling and unsatisfactory conditions and deliver them to safety or better conditions. And they built it on this per capita system, which meant that the provinces then were rewarded by the more kids they took, the more money they got for this child welfare system. So each year that it was in operation, from the first year where they changed the law in 1951 to allow the provinces to operate with these on First Nations, it ended up with probably about 15,000 children in care by the year 1979. and the provinces were making quite a bit of money off of us. And they were, in many places, they were taking us and giving us to white families without checking on how we were doing. Like as soon as the adoption papers were signed, like say for me, it was at 2 years old, they closed my file and they never checked up on me. They never followed up to make sure I was in a safe home. And in my case, I wasn't. I was in a very terrible home that went through a lot of really disturbing stuff. And that's how I ended up as being complex PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also wasn't a lot of support for me growing up in that. So I had to deal with, my neurodivergence on my own, all that, autism, ADHD, everything that I had to do was sort of self-coping mechanisms. And it was only recently that I realized that because of all the trauma I went through in that period, I didn't realize that I was activating this ancestral knowledge through my DNA, through what's known as epigenetics.
So
In
can I
terms of,
ask, I just want to go in and ask a little bit about that. When you say ancestral knowledge, white person over here asking this question, what does that mean to you?
in terms of what I researched, epigenetics is a new field of study where they're looking at how traumatic instances in your past can literally write these. I shouldn't use the word literally, but it writes to your DNA so that it can be activated by your descendants moving forward. So, in terms of First Nations people, which have been through like different traumas every single generation, systematic traumas, but also individual traumas that you might face, from particular events that might happen to yourself. Each of those traumatic events can waken up different coping mechanisms, and I call them superpowers. And but it's like the hypervigilance, the hyper awareness, the sarcastic wit. There's all these different aspects that natives have to cope with the world, and I recognize them as ancestral knowledge that have been awakened through epigenetics, and they have been given to the descendants to survive. And these were things that were developed in the past through trauma by our ancestors.
It's interesting, because as you're talking and you're saying hypervigilance and you used another word, hyper awareness. Anyway, these are symptoms. If you look at the DSM, they're symptoms of disorders, of illnesses, of disease, and really what they are as you said, they're coping mechanisms, and ways that we learn to protect ourselves. And I like that you call them superpowers because I think they really are. I think that children who go through a good deal of trauma become so hypervigilant. They are aware of things happening that other people just don't see at all. So,
yeah. So like I've gained certain things, like the way I see the world, the way I can deep dive into information, the way I can do like pattern recognition through autism, the way I can like gather up all this information and synthesize it and come up with conclusions that other people just don't seem to get. And when I was doing that TikTok recently on epigenetics, I was using the movie Encanto as a way to relay that story to general population. And I was talking about how these characters all have different powers, and my power is sort of more similar to Bruno, where he has an ability to see the world. He has an ability to synthesize information and tell the truth and tell people what's going on. And people seem to be mystified by that. They don't really understand that. It's just his way of just gathering that information and bringing it back.
And Encanto is the movie. It's an animated movie that came out 4 years ago. I can't remember. It's about around there. It's a lovely story. It really is a lovely story. And I like the way that you have interpreted it in terms of these coping mechanisms in this historical intergenerational way of passing on coping mechanisms and superpowers.
Yeah. So those superpowers are, they're intergenerational. They're developed through trauma. And in that particular movie, the young girl Mirabella is the first, child in that whole lineage who doesn't have trauma background, so she doesn't have a superpower. whereas every other relative has been through trauma, intergenerationally. So they've all developed these different abilities, like being the chameleon or being the strong one, or healing through food, or all these different things that you can have. Like in my family, I have the comedian, I have the one who has the ability to just be razor sharp wit and just pinpoint a situation and just upend people from where they are. So we
Right.
all have these different abilities and coping mechanisms that we've developed through our traumatic past. And our ancestors wrote those to our DNA, and then we activated them through our current trauma. And in my particular case, I've been through so much trauma that I tended to wake up a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, it's so interesting that trauma does that. And of course, I knew this when I worked with trauma survivors, that they had abilities that nobody else had. And
Mhm.
mostly because they had to develop them. It wasn't a question of, somehow a magical skill developed. It was developed out of the sheer necessity to survive.
And that's exactly what the study of epigenetics is. Like I have the ability to stop time. So like when I was in a car accident, when the car was rolling over, I was able to brace myself and react to it. And it was like the car was moving in slow motion. And I was watching my friends ahead of me, like smash their heads against the wall and not being able to help themselves. They
Hmm.
were in a different sense of time than me. And when I told my doctor about that incident, he was saying that that's a special gift, like a special power. And he said, I should have been like an emergency driver or an ambulance driver or something like that. He says, because that's a recognized skill.
Really? I'd never heard that
Yeah.
before. Now, from my perspective, being entrenched in this mental health field and knowing how the professional field reacts to things like that, if you walked into
Mhm.
a psych ward and said, I can stop time, they would think you were crazy.
Well, not stop time. It's your
Control.
brain is operating so fast that it feels like everything's moving in slow motion.
Right. Oh, that makes more sense. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Had you hit your head?
I didn't get injured at all.
Okay,
I
that's
was
very
I
cool.
was able to brace myself, and I was watching my friends like bash back and forth, and I just couldn't understand why they weren't doing the same thing.
Right.
And then when I told my doctor about that, he told me what it was.
Right.
That ability to do that is very unique.
It is very unique. I'm sure very, very few people have it. Epigenetics. Let's just talk about that just a little bit. I think that what you're talking about is the same thing that's talked about from the descendants of folks who went through the Holocaust and concentration camps. They talk
Mhm.
about that trauma going down through their DNA, and that's usually how it's put. It's put out as
Mhm.
the trauma. You're not doing that. You're talking about as coping mechanisms and superpowers that are passed on because of the
Well,
trauma.
what?
But
Yeah, the way I see it is like your ancestors have been through this traumatic event, and it awakened these abilities in them in that time, and those abilities were written to your DNA. They were highlighted in your DNA to be activated
mhm,
if you go through similar events in your own time. So that's my take on it. And you also have to think that epigenetics is not really understood. The way my thinking of it is more based on lived experience and the way I perceive it, but it's not really to an exact science like that.
right.
So
Yeah.
um, it's not really understood. And when you're dealing with First Nations people, you're also dealing with research limitations in that many researchers cannot investigate us to determine things like that because of all the abuses in terms of that in research that were done in the past. Like, for example, in the Indian residential schools, they purposely starve children to test nutritional supplements.
Yes.
There's all these different research things that happen that limit what they can do today to study, um, things like epigenetics.
Yeah.
And there's a paper I was reading on epigenetics for First Nations where they don't want it to pinhole or label us because it's can limit our care going forward or the way we I just wrote it this morning and I just can't think of the word I was
That's
using,
okay.
but yeah.
So if they don't pinhole you, it would influence how other people provide care or provide. Is that what you're
Well,
getting at?
I can send you the paper, but the paper is basically talking about how we're a vulnerable population, and it was considering Indigenous people. It was also considering autistic people. I happen to be both. But it was saying that epigenetics can be used to study these people, but because we're vulnerable, we don't have a choice in how that research is developed or used. And because of that, it can label us and make it so that we don't, it can limit our, I guess, our learning or care going forward because of that.
Yes. I mean, one person's shortcoming and inability to see is going to have a major impact if they say this is how you should do something, right? Because they've been limited in what they can see. You talk about a vulnerable population, and of course, we're talking about the residential schools in particular, where that's where my mind goes. And I just want to make a point here that at some point after the Second World War, countries like Canada and the US vied for the immigration of the doctors from the Holocaust to come here because they had been able to, they had a confined population that had no power, and they were able to do medical experiments that were not allowed here because of our ethic boards. And so, what they did is they bid on these people. And so Canada has Nazi doctors that came here after the Second World War. And if they were to continue on doing their work, everyone can surmise that they would also need a population that was vulnerable and had no power and had no ability to control what was happening to them. And certainly First Nations children going to residential schools without the ability of their parents to protect them or oversee their care made them perfect targets for that. And though I don't have any evidence that that's what happened, certainly the things that I've heard that happened in residential schools, particularly medical research, makes me wonder whether or not that was part of what happened there.
Yeah, I've read about that myself as well.
Yeah,
how they purposely starved communities, and they treated communities as a control group and allowed them to suffer like that.
yeah.
Without, even though they knew what they were going through and they could provide them food and resources, they didn't. So they could study the effects of starvation on a population.
Yeah, there's also, and I apologize to people for not giving a trigger warning before we started this part of the conversation, but I will give that now, a trigger warning. I'm going to talk about electroshock. There are stories that come out of the residential schools about kids being exposed to electric shock. And I know that that is another form of human experimentation that was done outside of ethic board purview. So,
yeah.
So
yeah,
yeah,
they did a lot of this under the guise that they were, trying to make it, what was the term for it? Save the man and kill the Indian. But they treated us like animals, and they treated us pretty horribly. And that treatment continued through the 60 scoop. And the 60 scoop was an attempt to assimilate us, but also remove us from our families so that we would be able to be assimilated. And one of the things they didn't anticipate was that epigenetics, where we did have access to that ancestral knowledge in order to not be assimilated and not to disappear like they wanted us to.
Yeah. One of the things I know about torture is that one of the worst things you can do to a mother to torture her is to remove her children. So it's these things are known. It's not like this was just done. They were done with a plan. We just need to take a little break, but we'll be right back, folks.
Co-op Radio is listener supported and listener owned. As a Co-op Radio member, you can join the broadcasters who create and present radio shows, as well as have a say in the station's management. You'll own a part of the station. All this for just as little as $5 a month, and tax deductible too. For details, go to coopradio.org and press the donate button. That's coopradio.org.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm chatting with Weetigo. I came across you on TikTok, and the first one that I saw, you were talking about racism that happens in the medical system and how impactful that is. And I have someone in my family who was Indigenous who died from pneumonia. And I believe partially died from pneumonia because he resisted going to the hospital and dealing with that medical system. And if you're dealing with a system that is racist towards you and not helping you when you're feeling so sick and awful and vulnerable and close to death, it makes it just that much harder to engage. And he died because of that. So you were
So,
talking, sorry?
so I've identified 4 different characteristics that First Nations have in regards to anti-Indigenous racism with the healthcare system. And the one you just mentioned there is one of them. It's called avoidance of healthcare because of past traumatic events in dealing with doctors and medical systems. So because of the bad situations that have happened, many individuals like myself are scared to go to a doctor because we don't think we're going to get the same care as everyone else. We've been through abusive situations and torture and denial of service, and we just don't get believed. A lot of the doctors, because of who we are, because of the other factors that are involved, they treat us as drug seeking. They treat us as lying about our condition, and they don't have the capacity or the understanding to understand what our symptoms are because we don't present like everyone else, because we do have that trauma informed background, because we do have that masking, or we might be hyposensitive. There's all these different factors that are involved that prevent us from getting the same sort of care as everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So health avoidance is a huge factor, and it's a very toxic behavior, and it's a learned behavior, and it's at the same time, the only way I can actually get care if I'm sick or if I'm in pain is if I wait until the last minute, because I know if I go before that, the doctors will never accept me
Right.
because of all these different factors. And one of those factors is hyposensitivity, which is where I don't report stimuli to pain like anyone else. I have a very high pain tolerance, and I can be sitting there with a burst gallstone, 1 week of sepsis, and I can still carry on a conversation like normal. Whereas an individual who is in 1 day of a burst gallstone will be sitting on the floor rolling in pain and screaming
Mm-hmm.
and crying.
Mm-hmm.
So when the doctors see me presenting and describing my symptoms, they think I'm lying. And they don't give me the test or the proper test that I need. So like in the case where I actually did have sepsis, where I was dying, where I was going through delirium, and I didn't have much time left to live, they were sending me home again for the 3rd time. And did not realize what was going on. It was only because of a doctor who had done some blood testing at a different walk-in clinic, who happened to call my cell phone at that exact moment when I was being discharged, that he was able to advocate on my behalf and get me to the surgery that I needed. And I had multiple surgeries, and I had complications because of how long they waited. And even with the doctors finally addressing what was going on, the doctor who was denying me care still didn't tell me what was going on, put me in my bed without informing me she was giving me morphine for the first time in my life,
Oh my
and
God.
left me on the bed by myself where I was crying, and I didn't know what was going on. I was terrified. And then 2 hours later, an ambulance came in and took me to St. Boniface Hospital for my first 2 surgeries. And I didn't even know where I was going, or I didn't even know what was wrong with me, because she didn't think it was important to tell me any of that information. And I've been told since then that I could file a complaint against her and that she should be disciplined by the physician's board, or what it's called. But they take advantage of people like me who are autistic, or who are in a situations where we don't have the executive function to do tasks like that. We can't report them. So these doctors and nurses who have been terrible to us have typically been safe to be as horrible as they want to be, because we don't. There's no repercussions for that.
I'm listening as you talk and recognizing there are so many levels in the ways in which, just in that experience alone, the ways in which you were not treated as a human being, or not treated with respect, or not even been allowed to define what was true for you in that moment. And not trauma informed. It just begs the question, and how can anyone in the healthcare profession not, who has an Indigenous client, not do it from a trauma informed place? because you live
But
with
the
trauma.
but the thing is that what I'm coming up with and the way I'm like presenting these issues, I'm presenting it as someone who's worked through them all and gone through that, that autistic pattern recognition and coming up with what is actually happening. And at the same time, no one else has ever come up with that idea before. Like people have come up with different aspects of it, but they've never put it all together where they've realized that this anti-Indigenous racism is caused by these four different factors. The uncanny valley effect, where you're, as a highly masked individual, you don't have the capacity to operate in society without someone realizing that you don't fit in. You're always presenting that unease or that inability to fit in, so you're always triggering that sense of unease or fear to those doctors who see you, and then.
But don't you,
The
I'm just going to interrupt
hypersensitivity.
you. I'm sorry. But don't you feel that it's the doctor who's sitting there with all the power and privilege? It's their responsibility to become informed about neurodiversity or being trauma informed. And I keep going back to that because I know I've worked with trauma survivors and they do the same thing. They will define a crisis as a couple seconds before I die. That's when I'm in crisis. That's it. That's the moment, right? I have a trauma background and people tell me that I have the highest pain tolerance that they've ever seen. I'm able to dissociate pain. I hate pain. I will dissociate it. And so like you, I don't present as somebody in pain and I get misunderstood. But I don't deal
But
with all.
the thing
Sorry?
is, though, we have so many of them because of the intensity of the trauma that we've been through.
Right.
So we have like we have the coping mechanisms, the superpowers that we have that
Right.
make it so they cannot relate to us. Like we're operating on a different level than them.
Yes.
I'll give you an example. When I first went to New York City, I was invited to go to this meeting, and these were all the BIPOC gay male men leaders in the community in terms of all the health organizations in the city. And my boss asked me to go with him and sit down with him. And he asked me after the meeting what I thought of it. And I gave him a half-hour reading of every single person that was in their meeting, using my hypervigilance, using my hyper-awareness, where I told him about everyone's motivation, what they were there for, how they listened to what he was saying. And I gave him such a detailed reading that he was just in shock listening to me. He says, you know these people better than me, and I've been working with them for 7 years. And he
Oh,
just couldn't understand how I had the ability to look at people like that and see through them and read everything about them. Like I have all these different capacities and abilities because of all of my, neurodivergent talents as well as my coping mechanisms.
right.
And they all amass me into someone who these doctors just can't fathom, who terrifies them.
Right.
And
Right.
and that's the difference. When I'm going to get care, they react to me because I'm operating at a different level than, and
Right.
there's really no other way to say it.
So tell me about autism. How does that operate within you?
For me, I have complex PTSD and autism, and I'm finding out just 2 days ago that they work in opposition to each other.
Oh my Lord.
So complex PTSD is something that suppresses that self-expression. It suppresses those things in order to heal you, in order to shut you down and to protect you. But at the same time, as for autism, when you're masking and when you're shutting down that self-expression, and it creates this burnout effect where you can't operate, and then you end up in a severe depression because that your self-expression is not being allowed to manifest it or to exhibit. So you have these two things happening on different extremes. So one of the things I had to figure out, because when I was in my 20s, I did go into deep depression because I was dealing with my sexuality, because I was dealing with my sexual abuse, and I was dealing with the physical abuse that had happened to me as a child. And I couldn't come to terms with who I was as an individual in terms of my sexuality because of all these things that my complex PTSD was shutting down and making me shut down and making me close off. And as I grew older through my 20s, the depression got even worse until I ended up in full burnout cycle where I'd be on the floor in a ball crying and just not understanding what was going on. And then finally realizing, only after I went through the ideation where I tried to hurt myself, and where I don't know how I managed to get through that, where I survived, um, and then where I was actually able to address it and said, okay, well, I guess I'm alive. I might as well deal with it. So I started. That's when I decided to confront my birth family about the abuse I went through. That's when they disowned me, when I confronted them about that abuse.
When you
That's
say
when I
your birth
decided.
family, do you mean your
I
adopted
mean, my
family?
adopted family. My adopted family.
Okay, I'm
My
just trying to
apologies.
keep it clear. So this was your
Yeah.
adopted, you confronted them
hmm
about the
I
abuse?
confronted my adopted mother on Christmas when I was 23. I went to up north to Leaf Rapids, and I had a talk with her, and I told her about all the stuff that is happening. And I told her, I said, I knew that she had heard me screaming for her, because I would scream for her as loud as I could. And she was in the bedroom and the floor beneath me, and she never ever came to save me, not once. And I told her, I said, I knew you heard me. And I said, I knew, and I tried to get you to come save me. And she says, I didn't think it was that bad. So then I told her everything that my abuser had done. And she was sitting there in a puddle, like she was just crushed, and she was crying. And she was like, I didn't know. And she was just crying, right? But then when I went to go back to the family gathering in Easter, which was a few months later, 4 months later, I found out that my entire family, each of them had changed their phone number, and I could not reach any of them.
So
And
I'm
I
just
got
I'm just going to ask you a quick question, because just to flesh that out. So you went and you confronted your adopted mother about the fact that she had to have known something was happening to you that was
mhm,
horrible because you were screaming, and you mentioned your abuser. You don't have to say who your abuser was, but was this somebody within the family?
mhm,
Okay.
yes,
So what they did then is, after you confronted them, they all changed their name, and then what happened? Or not their
they
name. I'm
changed
sorry, they
their.
changed their phone number.
I've actually tracked down one of my niece Suzanne, and I asked her what happened, and I said I can't reach anyone. Everyone's like, no one's number is the same anywhere. What's going on? And she says, well, we'll let you know if we want to talk to you. And then she hung up on me, and she never asked for my phone number. So I realized then, like instantly, that that was it. They
So you were
they
disowned.
were Yeah, I was disowned. So I went home and I went and looked for every picture I could have of my childhood, and I burned everything. I don't have a single picture except for one which I found by fluke, but all of my childhood memories are gone in terms of the proof that I was with that family.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
a
it was,
huge thing to do.
but at the same time, it was healing. It was cathartic in that I was able to move away from that
Hmm.
trauma, and I was able to move forward. And then I ended up going. I was in Vancouver. I came out. I ended up going to New York, and for the gay games and the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. I got a big paper article in the Village Voice, and I ended up working for this uh, Indigenous company as a queer Indigenous man. And that self-expression, that ability to work through all that trauma and all that pain, I didn't realize then that was the rebirth of and getting on the other side of that burnout cycle, that
Hmm.
autistic burnout cycle. And I didn't
Hmm.
know what that was at the time.
Right.
And I didn't realize that in 5 more years I'd be going through the same thing again, but with a
Uh,
different issue.
we just need to take a little break, but we'll be right back.
Great flood of tears that we've cried for our brothers and sisters who've died. Over 500 years has washed away our fears and strengthened our pride. Now we turn back the tide. We will no longer hear your commands. We will slide your control from our lands. Redirect the flame of our anger and pain. voice of our forefathers sings. The will to live will be done. We will no longer be pawns to greed and to war. We will be idle no more. And we must stand for the right to be free. And we will rebuild a just society. And we will sing, we will sing, we will sing our own song. And we will stand for the right to be free. And we will rebuild a just society. And we will sing, we will sing, we will sing our own song. When the ancient drum rhythms ring, the voice of our grandmother sings. Native America run, we will no longer succumb to oil and to ore. We will be idle no more. And we must stand for the right to be free. And we will rebuild our own society. And we will sing, we will sing, we will sing our own song. And we will teach about the right to be free. And we will rebuild our own society. We will sing, we will sing, we will sing our own song. Oh, dance, dance for the right to be free. We will rebuild our own society. And we will sing, we will sing, we will sing our own song. And then run away and occupy for the right to be free. And we will rebuild a just society. And we will sing, we will sing, we will sing our own song.
Hi everyone, this is Bernadine Fox from Rethreading Madness that airs on Vancouver Co-op Radio every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Vancouver Co-op Radio CFRO 100.5 FM is a unique nonprofit community radio station and podcast recording studio that provides a voice for those underrepresented in the mainstream media. They provide the airwaves for Rethreading Madness to examine mental health from individual and important perspectives. They do so with donations from folks like you. If you have appreciated Rethreading Madness and are able to donate, you can do so in 3 ways. With a credit card, you can visit www.coopradio.org. That's www.coopradio, all one word, .org, and hit the donate button on the top right-hand side of the screen. Then follow the directions. Or you can mail a check to 370 Columbia Street in Vancouver, BC, B4A 4J1. Or you can e-transfer your donation directly to admin@coopradio.org. That's admin. A as in Apple, D as in David, M as in Mary, I, and N as in Norman @coopradio.org. Make sure to note Rethreading Madness with your donation. And then come join us every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Until then, stay safe out there.
Tanuyap. Kuiget Yuans Kuyansna. Hi everybody, my name is Kuiget Yuans. I'm a member of the Squamish Nation and the Yagalanas clan of the Haida Nation. You're listening to Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We live, work, play, and broadcast from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm talking to Weetigo about his experience of all manner of things. You were just talking about having been disowned and how that, in fact, led to a very important part of your life.
Yeah, well, I came out, I started working with my community. I was working with the Indigenous community in New York City for the American Indian Community House. I ended up getting my what's it called, my social security card because of the Jay Treaty, and I actually started dealing with my status, and I reclaimed that through the reconciliation process they had in Manitoba, where I got my status back with my father's band, which is Poundmaker Cree Nation.
Mm-hmm. So you took something that was horrible that happened to you, i.e. they disowned you, and turned it into something incredibly positive for yourself.
I regarded this burnout cycle nowadays, I regard it as a begin again, in terms of, like, you know, how a lot of people have burnout, they dread the period.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's a period where I realize that I'm going through a cycle where I have to address something that's causing this depression, and I have to focus in on what is causing that and work through that. And once I work through that, I know I'm going to be, it's like a phoenix where you rise up and you start off in a new direction, and I know that's going to happen now. I know the burnout cycle is about addressing some, you know, something that's blocking me. And once I break through that, I'm going to be flying again and going in a different direction.
So we've talked about how CPTSD and autism kind of work against each other, but then you also have ADHD. And how does that fit in for you? Must complicate it even more?
I'm full of complications and I'm full of contradictions. So
Yay.
It's like when you're autistic and you're ADHD, you crave order, but at the same time as ADHD, you don't have the capacity to clean up. So it creates this conflict where you're not sure what's going on, where you can't take care of what you need to, and at the same time you need it in order to function.
Right.
So for me, I can sort of focus sometimes and clean up, but for me it's a huge process to dig things out. And it was only recently where I discovered different authors like Casey Davis and Atomic Habits, where I'm able to bring these skills into my life, where I can now have no problem with cleaning my house or maintaining order. But it was learning these skills through these different authors that I came across that helped me a lot.
And are they fiction authors, or are they?
Well, Casey Davis does this book called Tending the House While Drowning. And it's
I'm sorry, that's a great title. Okay. Tending your house while drowning. Okay.
And it's for people who are ADHD who can't manage their house, where their whole place is in a mess. And it gives them, concepts like small victories, where you can use those to dig yourself out of these situation that you're in, and bring yourself into a point where you actually have a clean home again.
Right.
Or where you can function again.
Right.
And Atomic Habits is another author. I can't remember the author's name, but he gives you steps in order how to build habits that you can, move forward in your life and start operating again and develop healthy habits.
And that's the thing about ADHD, is that it is a problem with executive functioning, but it's not a problem that you can't apply skills to. You can learn skills, you can develop them, right? And so if you're 5 and you can't remember your shoes to go out the door, you can develop the skill where you remember your shoes. I mean, it's not an end. It's just the beginning. It's kind of what you're saying.
And then something interesting in terms of more recently, I decided to get rid of every fast dopamine thing that I was doing. I got rid of my PlayStation. I stopped watching television. I got rid of coffee and marijuana and all these different things that interfere with my ability to function, or they give me a fast dopamine rush. So I eliminated all that from my life. So the only way I can get dopamine now is through work and slow things and things that take work to develop. And
Wow.
since then, my growth has been incredible in terms of how I've been moving forward because of that. And I got that from this YouTuber named ADHD Gamer on YouTube. We, so his podcast was definitely very useful for me to deal with my ADHD and pretty much beat it because of the skills that he was able to relate through his podcast.
So you did it by recreating or redeveloping and implementing a different system of getting dopamine released from your brain. And if people don't know what dopamine is, it is the feel good hormone, enzyme, whatever you want to call it. What is it? What is dopamine? I want to say chemical, but
Yes,
I don't even think it's a chemical. But anyway, it makes you feel
yeah,
good. So if you are
mhm,
somebody who smokes cigarettes, and I know this because I used to, you take that drag, you get a hit of dopamine, it makes you feel good. If you don't take that drag and try and quit smoking, you don't get your hit of dopamine and you feel terrible. And you feel terrible for a long time until your brain figures out how else to make dopamine. So, what you did was you took away the things that gave you immediate hits of dopamine
mhm,
and developed a
yeah,
strategy to
yeah,
create habits that give you dopamine in other ways.
yeah, by doing hard work. So
Hard
now
work.
I get dopamine. Now I get dopamine from doing hard work, larger projects. The video projects, the research projects I do.
Hmm.
Those things all were very rewarding and very much
Yes.
giving me dopamine. But
Yes.
they take a lot of work to do those things. They're
Yes.
not something where I can just jump down and smoke a joint or something like that, like I used to. And the other thing was I learned that I have an Apple Watch, which was tracking my blood oxygen levels, and I was noticing that my brain fog seemed to mirror times where I was smoking heavily, where
Mm,
my oxygen blood levels were at their lowest.
right.
So by eliminating marijuana from my life as well, I found that my brain is able to function a lot more. And then also being diagnosed with ADHD in June 30th this year and starting Concerta, I was able to heal a lot of my synapses, my brain functioning in terms of my memory, in terms of
Right.
how I operate.
So you
So
mean the executive functioning, the short-term memory stuff? Is that what you're talking about?
um, like for example, I was the very first day I took Ritalin, which is or Concerta. It's from the Ritalin family. I was out, not really expecting much, didn't really think much of it, and I was listening to this song, "Fast Car," and for the first time in probably 30 years, I knew every single word. And I
Wow.
could sing every single word. I like my brain was like healing listening to this song, and I was able to anticipate every word that was coming up and think to it. They do flourishes and remember the notes and the words and I was just bawling. I was crying because like it was for me it was a very intense moment because it's like I realized like my brain was working now. Like
Right.
like like the way my memory worked before this, like memory would only show up the second before I needed it, but not, I couldn't think of things beforehand. My brain was so dysfunctional, because of how I let it go. Uh, I'm in my 50s now, and I probably don't have the same, nutrients in my body as I did when I was in my youth. So
Right.
for me, I've had to heal myself in my 50s and become as functioning as I am now today.
Hmm.
So
You're also gifted.
mm,
Can you
yes,
talk
I
to me
found that out.
about how, I mean, you're a complex person here. You have autism, you have ADHD, you have CPTSD from trauma, you have the epigenetic stuff happening because of trauma in from your community and from your ancestors, but you're also gifted.
Yeah, when I was in school, I was a slow learner. Like I was, when I was very young, I was very slow to speak, and they thought I had developmental problems, and they thought I was dumb, to be honest, is how they described it. And when I hit grade three, when we started taking math, I realized I fell in love with math. I fell in love with like, times tables, addition, subtraction, all that. And I would just sit there and focus on it and study it for hours. And just for me, it was a joy because it was like a new language. And I started excelling in school, and that started translating into all the other subjects where I started doing really good in school. And actually, like say, for example, when I took the grade 12 provincial exam, I scored 100% on our math exam. And the principal took me into that for like, he thought I cheated.
Yeah, I was going to say
And,
that. Did he think you cheated?
uh,
Because
yeah, he thought I
that's
cheated.
where they go. So,
And then he brought in Mr. Isaac to come in, and he says, "Well, how come Frederick got 100%?" And or I was called Thomas. I went by my middle name at the time. Mr. Isaac says, "No, that's just Tommy." He says, "That's just the way he is." And when I went into university at the University of Manitoba, I took some calculus courses from Dr. Donald Trim or Professor Donald Trim. And back in those days, he used to give out the marks based on who got the highest mark. And I was sitting in the back in my red parka, like wrapped up, like, totally, hiding out from the world, taking university. I just escaped from the north and from that all that abuse up there. And I remember the very first test, I got like the highest mark in the class. And he held up my paper and he was calling out my name. And I was sitting in the back. I was refusing to go. But I was in this Indigenous program at university. My students I was with, they outed me to the teacher and they pointed out that it was me. So I remember going up to the front, like just, my head down, totally embarrassed. Like I was just like,
oh God.
and then he gave me my paper, like the 100% in calculus. And I was dying inside. And, but yeah, I was really good in terms of math. I was really good at inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, all these different ways. And
That's patterning,
sort of
isn't
how
it?
I operate.
Forgive me.
It's
Is deductive
patterning.
reasoning
Yeah.
about patterning? Okay.
Yeah. And inductive reasoning is coming up with, determining where something's going to go or where it's going to end up.
Right.
So it's being able to deduce that. So there's several types of reasoning, and I have both.
Right.
And
Right.
then, so
And what do you do with them now?
right now I'm just doing my research on discovering about my brain,
Right.
my conditions.
Right.
And I'm learning how and then I'm finding out that they're all connected and they're all related to a lot of the difficulties we're going through as Indigenous people and a lot of the abuses that we're going through as Indigenous people, like in terms of the anti-Indigenous racism that we're experiencing in the healthcare system right now. So,
Have you got a plan on how you're going to get this information out to the world? Because I personally, in my little humble way, think it's very important.
I'm sort of right now as I'm coming up with all of this writing in terms of all this idea, and it seems to be resonating with people. Like, and they're also finding healing and answers to stuff that they're dealing with themselves. So I don't have, I have 12 years of post-secondary education, but I've never actually got a degree for anything because of my complex PTSD has always put me in a position where I didn't feel I was worthy of the reward. So I would always pull out at the last minute. And it took me many years to realize that I did have complex PTSD, and I only started addressing that in 2021.
Right.
So that's a lot of times of going to school and not getting any degree for it, but spending all the time and putting the effort in.
Right.
So,
Well, it may be possible for you to take what you did in all those 12 years and put it all together and maybe take a class and you'll be finished. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know how these things go.
well, I remember John Glanville tried to get me go back to the University of Manitoba where I had done 3.5 years of school and I had aced a lot of my courses. And he was trying to get me to get a Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics. But he had passed away. I guess apparently he was searching for me and other students like me for about a decade.
Wow.
But at the time I had been going to the States and I ended up going overseas to Africa where I was working for UNESCO, ICBA as a teacher trainer. And he just wasn't able to find me in time before he passed.
Right.
And then when I did go to the Applied Sciences department myself and asked about it, they told me I would have to take everything over again, even though other programs at the University of Manitoba say, that course has never changed. They're still teaching the same books. But when I went to the actual department itself, they said, no, you'll have to take everything over again. They wouldn't consider giving me any recognition for that, for the time I spent there.
You might check in with another university and see what they say. Maybe. I mean, things are transferable between universities, but I'm not an expert in that.
That was so long ago. That was so long ago. That was in the 80s.
I know, but you know what I've heard about post-secondary is that once you've done it, and it sticks. It's like forever. But maybe things have changed in this time frame.
Because I went to the University of Manitoba to see if I could pick up some courses and get a fast degree of using some of those courses. They told me I would have to take every single thing over.
God, yikes.
Yes, so I wouldn't get any. I don't have any credit. Like, even though my GPA is still above 2.7, I don't actually get it. Like, and that's with me quitting twice and getting 0 on a whole slew of courses because I took off across the country.
Right.
I still have a decent GPA there.
Frederick, we're coming to the end of this time. Is there anything you want to say to finish off?
Right now, I guess I should say I'm working on addressing anti-Indigenous racism in the healthcare system, and I'm working with an organization called the First Nation Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba to address the dearth of research on this topic right now, and also to work with organizations like Southern Chiefs Organization and KIM, which is MKO, in terms of addressing the Health Transformation Initiative and making sure that the issues that I'm identifying through my TikTok are included in their health transformation initiatives that they're doing.
Right. Sounds exciting. I hope that
it's a lot of work.
It is. I'm sure it is, but it does sound exciting. And if you can make changes happening, that's going to be a whole lot of dopamine for you.
Yeah, and I want to do a book.
Yes.
I want to write a book, but I don't know how to start. So that's where I'm at right now.
Well, having written a book, I can tell you start anywhere it starts. That's where you start. Mm-hmm. Just start. And don't worry about where it is in the whole frame of the book. Just start. And you'll figure out the rest after. Okay. How do people reach you? Weetigo?
They can catch me on TikTok. Go to WEETIGO. I think you just find my username there. I have the same username on other socials, but I seem to have been shadow banned on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. So unfortunately, I don't. My stuff doesn't really get shared there anymore.
Yeah, and I've heard that a lot of people who are First Nations find the same thing. So you're not alone. You're in very good company there. Mm-hmm. So Weetigo on TikTok. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It has been enlightening. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
And that's our show. My thanks to Weetigo for having this conversation with me. If you want to reach him, best to do it through TikTok. His handle there is @Weetigo, and that's spelled W, double E as in Edward, T as in Tom, I, G as in George, O. Or you can send him a message here and we'll forward it on to him. Our music today was by Buffy St. Marie and Sherry Ulrich, and as always, we thank them for the gift of their music. But more importantly, our thanks goes out to you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. You've just listened to Rethreading Madness, where we dare to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.